Good morning, environmental anthropology students. This is your professor, Adam Dunstan. Sorry that I can't be there today. I apologize for that, but thank you for being understanding as I take some extra time to recover with my wife and get used to being parents. Now, I will be back next Thursday, very much looking forward to it when we're going to talk about climate change. For this week, however, we're talking about food, agriculture, and GMOs, and I'm really excited to talk about this topic. This is something that I've been interested in for a long time. In fact, even when I was a senior in high school, my senior project was on sustainable agriculture. My environmental science degree, I learned under many different soil scientists that were very focused on agriculture. I work with a group of people who does small-scale agriculture, so agriculture is something that's very interesting to me in my work, and I hope interesting to you as well. Now let's talk a little bit about planet Earth. Planet Earth, of course, is our life support system. As material beings reliant on certain chemicals, human beings are ultimately fully dependent on the resources provided by Earth, of course. And there's a great quote by Guy McPherson on this. If you really think the environment is less important than the economy, try holding your breath while you count your money. Another kind of story that goes along with this is one time I was talking to somebody, another anthropologist, an economic anthropologist, and I asked him, what's your specialty? And he said economic anthropology. And I said, oh, you're an environmental anthropologist specializing in the economy. My point being that you can't think of the economy apart from the environment. Anything that the economy distributes in terms of goods is ultimately from the environment. And even when the economy is distributing services from human beings, say legal services or financial services, human beings must eat, must breathe, must drink, and therefore are dependent on natural resources. And so the economy is just one subset of the broader environment and can't be thought of as something that doesn't rely on the environment. Let's talk a little bit specifically about food in the environment. Food ultimately comes from the environment. Obviously, it didn't get magically produced by Walmart or by Kroger, but rather ultimately had to be grown somewhere by carbon-based beings. Now, the production of food for humans is one of the most environmentally impactful forces in the entire world, period. Very large amounts of the biomatter on the face of planet Earth, at one point it was 40% was one estimate, goes toward human beings, and most predominantly towards human food consumption. And a lot of the land use that we do is actually not just from our cities, but actually a large part of our land use as human beings, our footprint on the planet, is in fact agriculture and food production or food gathering. Now, when I say that food production is one of the most environmentally impactful forces in the world, one of the things I'm getting at is that agriculture, by its very nature, modifies ecosystems. Now, this is not to say that it modifies them to a negative state. However, it is to say that it modifies them 100%. For agriculture to work, you have to modify an ecosystem from its natural course that it was following prior to human beings being involved, if we could think of it in that way. That's a bit of an artificial way to think of it, since human beings, in fact, are part of the environment. But for sake of argument, the environment would be one way if there were not human beings involved, right? Agriculture relies on modifying it. You, for example, cut down a bunch of trees that were there and sow a bunch of wheat. And you make sure that little smaller plants that we consider weeds don't get in there and take those out. And perhaps you use chemicals to make sure that there aren't pests, right? And all these different steps that you're doing, you're getting rid of different pieces of the ecosystem and substituting in the ones you want. Even if it's more of sort of a horticulture slash and burn shifting kind of system, that's still modifying the environment. So agriculture by its very nature modifies ecosystems. And one of the reasons it does that is because that can produce higher yields than just going out into the environment. And another reason it does that is because some of the plants that we most rely on are ones that have to be carefully cultivated and intentionally produced, like wheat, the example I just used. Now, even when there wasn't heavy agriculture, well, even before heavy agriculture, ecosystems have been being managed and manipulated for human food. So one example is First Nations people in Canada very intentionally using selective fires to clear out foresty areas, create meadows that are more attractive to large game, so that they would be able to hunt large game. Another example is the Amazon rainforest, which scientists are now realizing through very careful examination of the rainforest that much of it shows signs of having been used for agriculture or modified by human beings in the past. So this sort of Garden of Eden forest, as we've often treated it, is in fact, large parts of it at least, modified by human beings and the result of human being modification potentially centuries in the past. And so this brings up the point that our food production activities have huge impacts on the globe. Now, food and agriculture are often treated as less exciting than other environmental topics. They don't quite get this is starting to change in the last 5 or 6 years, I would say, but more so because people are interested in food more so for health reasons than environmental reasons. But when it comes to environmentalism, people are often more inclined to think about, panda bears going extinct or something along those lines, climate change, not driving your car as much, riding your bike to work, the pollution coming out of a smokestack, these sorts of topics. However, agriculture, a farmer plowing his field, is every bit as much of an important environmental issue, and I would argue potentially more important, or one of the most important. What you eat is by far and away one of the most direct environmental impacts that you have, and understanding food, therefore, on a very deep level, and how we get food, and where that food comes from, is essential to living wisely in the environment. And something that anthropology can add to this discussion, well, one thing it can add is the social and cultural dimensions around food production, and we saw a lot of that in the readings. Another thing that it can provide is by showing us many, many, many different examples of how people produce food in different cultures, partly so that we can have a good sense of what the different options are. Human cultures have adapted to countless different times to answer the basic question of how to get food, and produced in that way hundreds of different kind of specific ways of going about that. That means that in a sense we have hundreds of different options in our playbook when we're talking about how are we going to make food for future human populations, and part of anthropology is opening up those different options and showing what they are. Now let's talk a little bit about human beings. Human beings have a circulatory system, respiratory system, neural system, all these different things, all of which ultimately rely on physical nutrients, and particularly on energy, on ATP, among other things. And to get energy, energy must be released from the consumption of food. Now, there's what I call the 30-day rule, is essentially the fact that human beings, on average, cannot persist more than 30 days without food. Therefore, as a logical outgrowth of this, one of the most basic things a culture, any social group, has to do is figure out how to produce or gather or harbor food. The reason being that with people, if all your people die, you don't have a culture anymore. So for a culture to persist over generations, it has to figure out a way to keep people alive, so to speak. People have to figure out a way to feed themselves for their social group to persist, because ultimately a social group is made up of individual human beings that die if they don't get food. So this brings us to the issue of subsistence and subsistence strategies, which are, in one anthropology textbook, defined as just the pattern of obtaining one's food, which, as we will see, how people get their food, that varies tremendously between different cultures. It's not just, tractors and farmers' fields, right? That is a very American way of producing food. It is not the only way. So let's talk about some of those different ways. Fundamentally, the collection and production of food for human beings must face the basic problem that, among other things, many plants are not directly usable by human beings. We don't do well eating grass. We don't do well eating trees. So at the very least, we have to select certain plants within the environment to eat. And then similarly, you can't just sort of eat, well, how do I say this? Yeah, that'll be good for now. So the point is there are many parts of the environment that we can't directly consume. So we have to be selective about what we consume or intentionally produce the things that we can consume. Now, ultimately, all food, of course, comes from the environment. So this is a picture of a cow divided into different forms of meat that you would find at the supermarket. But the point is that all of those ultimately come from a cow, and cows ultimately feed on grasslands. Pastures are just modified grasslands in a sense. Now, by the way, a quick little tangent. As I talk about all the different ways that cultures produce food and create food, I want to clarify that I'll be speaking in what's called the ethnographic present, which means that I refer to cultures as living in this way, even if that's not how they do now, because perhaps it was very recently this is how they were living, and it was recorded by anthropologists this way. So we want to make a basic distinction when it comes to food between food collecting societies and food producing societies. And so some societies just do not do agriculture or domestication of any sort, and instead rely on resources found in the environment. And that is food collecting, so hunter-gatherers or forages. Now, to say that they don't do agriculture isn't to say that they don't modify their environment. We talked about burning, selective burning, intentional fires. That's one of the main ways that foragers can modify their environment. Other types of societies are food producing, meaning they very intentionally modify an ecosystem to produce in a domesticated way certain crops or certain animals. And the types of that are pastoralism, horticulture, agriculture, and industrialized agriculture. Thus, we have 5 different basic subsistence strategies: foragers, pastoralism, horticulture, agriculture, and then industrialized agriculture, which is essentially just an outgrowth of agriculture, but different enough to really constitute its own thing. Now, we're kind of in an odd place to be in our society in that whereas in much of human history, a large part of people in a society, or at least a much larger part than now, would be involved in food production. Many people would be farmers, many people would be ranchers. Many cultures that we find throughout the non-Western world, the entire society is involved in this, right? Particularly like pastoral and foraging cultures, everybody is involved in food production. If you are a Maasai, for example, you are involved in herding, right? Or if you are a Juhuanzi person, you are involved in hunting and gathering. That's simply how it is. That's your job by virtue of being born into this society. That's how you put food on your table, is by literally putting food on your table. And archaeologists would say that for the vast majority of human history, it was all foraging. And so again, in contrast with much of human history and human experience, or rather I should say much of human history and human experience is people's job was producing food, and they were very intimately connected with where their food came from because they were the ones that were getting it. Now, by contrast, Westerners are involved much less with the food they eat. We are much more used to just going to a supermarket and having this food neatly packaged, sometimes in such a way that we have almost no idea where the food actually came from. Think about crackers or breakfast cereal or Pop-Tarts, right? Now, how many Westerners are actually involved in agriculture? Well, in the U.S., at least until relatively recently, there seems to have been a bit of an upsurge in small-scale agriculture, but until relatively recently at least, less than 5% of Americans were involved in agriculture. That is a staggeringly small amount. That means only 1 in 20 Americans would have been in any way involved in food production, with the other 19 being bankers, accountants, professors, secretaries, doctors, rocket scientists, etc., and very disconnected from their food. They use cash produced by their jobs to go get food, and therefore they can go their entire life without directly seeing where food comes from, even though it is food that is sustaining their life day by day. We put food on the table in extremely indirect ways. And because of that, I think it's helpful to look at different cultures and how they get food to really see food as something that directly comes out of the environment and ultimately directly comes out of destroying other forms of life. So let's talk first and foremost about foraging. I'm going to check my time on how long I've been lecturing at this point. Okay, 13 minutes. So foraging. One of the originally most common, but now far less common methods of gaining food is foraging, sometimes called hunter-gathering or food collection. It relies on the products of the environment, gathering wild plants, hunting wild animals. It can come in 2 forms: generalized foraging, in which many different species are used, or specialized foraging. For example, the group that used to be called the Kwakiutl on the northwest coast, who rely heavily on salmon, and therefore use one resource very extensively. However, they still use other resources, but salmon are a large source of calories. So specialized or generalized foraging, but either way, reliant on wild products. Now, ultimately, many of groups that are doing foraging are much more mobile and seasonally track resources, right? They track the bison, for example. Some of the plains tribes like the Lakota would be tracking bison as they were moving throughout the landscape. And seasonality and when plants are available all played into this. There are exceptions to this, of course. These are some examples: Inuit in the lower right-hand corner, Ache in the upper right, etc. I believe the lower right is, well, I'm not going to guess because I don't want to make that wrong. Now, foraging societies, past and present. What kinds of groups were involved with this? The Juhuanzi, sometimes called the San or the Kung in Africa, southern Africa, the Hadza in Africa, in Tanzania, Aboriginal Australians, the Aceh in South America, a variety of Amazonian groups, the Inuit in North America, a number of different North American groups, the Lakota, many different foraging societies found really throughout many of, if not all of, the continents, inhabited continents. Now, whereas it was used to be much more common, and again, archaeologists would tell us that this was in fact the default mode of human existence before agriculture developed, it is now found in less than 1% of cultures, and it is found oftentimes in areas that were not wanted or desired by expanding agricultural civilizations. So as agricultural empires and nation states expanded, they took kind of the best areas for agriculture and left foragers with sort of these marginal areas. Sub-Saharan Africa, certain parts of the Amazon, the extreme Arctic, things like that. Now, there's often an assumption that hunter-gatherers are sort of living hand-to-mouth, always on the brink of starvation. And it is true that there are health problems relative to not having modern medical health care that we think of it that are associated with this. However, it is also true that actually, for one thing, the shift to agriculture initially brought actually health detriment. It seems to be what we see from the skeletal record. However, perhaps more to the point, what I wanted to bring up is that oftentimes foraging societies or hunting and gathering societies, although they do not produce food in the same quantities, they do produce food to survive day by day. And because they don't have a lot of accumulated goods, because they don't have a lot of possessions or wealth, and intentionally are very mobile to be able to follow things and don't put a lot of stock in prestige and goods, this allows them to be what Marshall Solins, famous anthropologist, called the original affluent society, in the sense that not that they have more than agricultural societies or industrial societies, but rather that they have less, but they also want less. And the amount of time that it takes to produce food is really not that much time, and because of that they have substantial amounts of leisure time. In contrast, say, with industrialized agricultural societies where many of us are working 40, 60, 80-hour weeks, foraging societies have been recorded by anthropologists as oftentimes being much fewer hours worked, giving you much more time to do things like socialize, tell stories, take part in religious ceremonies, connect with people. Many of the things that we would say we find very valuable but have very little time for. And again, they do this not so much by producing more, but by desiring less. What is the impact ultimately environmentally of foraging? Often it is in areas that would not be easily used for farming or grazing. Now, it is extremely low impact typically. Now, this can be modified, of course, but typically an extremely low environmental impact for pretty obvious reasons. You're going with the seasons, you're not heavily modifying the environment typically, and there's usually a very low population density. However, that brings up a central point, which is that foraging tends to only be able to produce very small or support small populations across relatively large landscapes compared to where agriculture can produce much more per acre, which is probably one of the reasons that many societies went over to agriculture. Now, the important implication of this is that as important as it is to understand foraging at current levels of human population of 7 to 8 billion, foraging is most likely not our sort of be-all, end-all answer to how we're going to solve environmental problems, because again, it can only support much smaller populations over larger areas. So let's consider instead how cultures came to agriculture. My apologies for that. We were taking care of the baby. So, eventually comes the Neolithic Revolution, estimated around 10,000 years ago. Archaeologists estimate that this was when human societies, and it didn't all happen at once, different human societies at different times, but learned to domesticate plants and animals. And Jared Diamond, who's a famous and somewhat controversial writer, says that this was the worst mistake in the history of the human race. because it directly led to, among other things, actually worse health right off the bat, although eventually improved health, because it was a less diversified diet from hunting and gathering, as well as having a number of different social impacts. Domestication allowed societies to go from food gathering to food producing. I'll be going through these slides extremely quickly. These are actually slides from a lecture that I do with my introductory anthropology class. I'm assuming that a lot of you are familiar with these concepts, and even if you're not, you do not need to know them super in depth. This is just to kind of give you a sense of the range of different food activities that people are involved in across the world. So please don't feel like you need to take notes on these slides. I'll be going through it extremely quick. Anything even remotely relevant to the exam is something I'll be covering verbally, and most of this is not going to be involved in the exam. So, Neolithic Revolution, domestication, societies went from food gathering to food producing, although not all societies did. Now, of the food producing societies, there's 4 basic types. One is pastoralism, which is basically the nomadic herding of domesticated animals, of livestock, whether that is sheep, camels, cattle, but as your main subsistence strategy. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It can be for milk, and there are cultures who use cattle primarily for milk products, some for meat products, in very rare instances for blood products, for use for blood as a form of hydration, among other things, and for fiber or wool. So the group that I work with, the Navajo, is a good example of a pastoral group that did sheep herding for both meat and wool. And this is often, though not always, nomadic, involving moving around with the herd, and often relies on exchange with agricultural groups, for example, kind of exchanging meat or wool for crops. Now, if we look at a map of where pastoralism was practiced traditionally, we see that it maps very closely onto places where there is very low precipitation. That is not always, but it is almost always the case. Again, the drier part of the Amazon, western United States, northern part of Africa, throughout the Middle East, etc., etc. And indeed, the conclusion that we would come to is that pastoralism is environmentally adaptive, at least in its traditional form, in the sense that it reflects a certain ecosystem in which there is sparse rainfall, and which is less useful for intense farming, because farming requires, prior to more contemporary forms of irrigation, farming requires at least a reasonable amount of rainwater. And without that, what you get is sort of more drier areas, deserts and grasslands, and human beings cannot typically eat grass or small desert plants. However, what can? Livestock can often eat scattered plant life, and especially grassy plants, and then turn that into meat through their bodies, which human beings can consume. So you take an environment that produces a natural resource that we don't need and can't use, grass or things like that, and then turns it into a commodity that's highly valuable, an item that's highly valued, in this case meat. Now, I'm talking about this in very business-like ways. However, at the end of the day, this is the way that pastoralists make their living, and so I'm comfortable talking about it in a somewhat business-like way. Now, there's a point here to be made about why we should maybe just let these things be in the adaptation of ways of life with the environment. Oftentimes, the indigenous or local population of an area have adapted a way of life, a way of subsistence that fairly closely matches the environment, and modifications to it can have pretty dramatically negative consequences. And a good example of that is the Great Plains. The Great Plains were used for small-scale horticulture as well as nomadic bison hunting by Plains tribes, by Plains Native American tribes. However, European settlers used it for quite intensive agriculture, particularly during the Depression era. The end result of this was the Dust Bowl, which was just an era in American history in which there was just rampant erosion of soil, plant die-offs, farms crashing, and people having to migrate as a result. By the way, if you've ever read the book Grapes of Wrath, that's what was going on there. Conversely, ultimately farming in that form led to catastrophic failure. Now, since then, farming has bounced back in the region, but the point is there was a catastrophic failure when farming was first introduced. Bison hunting, by contrast, involved, among other things, bison repeatedly hitting the ground, compacting the soil, and helping guard against erosion. And so again, oftentimes traditional subsistence strategies in some regards reflected the environment and helped sustain the environment in some way, at least in key resource ways. Now, horticulture is a second form. So we had, again, foraging among food collecting, and then among food producing we had pastoralism, and now number 2, horticulture. Horticulture is domesticated growing of plants or growing of domesticated plants on small areas using human labor and simple tools. For example, a digging stick is a very common technique with then seeds implanted in the ground. You find horticulture in the Amazon with slash and burn or sometimes Swidden agriculture. You find it, as the Townsend book talked about, in Southeast Asia. You find it in various parts of native North America, practiced by Native Americans, very small-scale agriculture, not with steel plows, not with animal labor. It is the earliest, in a sense, form of plant growing that developed, and also one of the most widespread and persistent. Now, how do horticultural, and examples, the Southeast Asian societies you read about, the Haudenosaunee tribe, the Navajo tribe, the Hopi tribe, countless Native American groups, countless Amazonian groups, like the Yanomami, just lots of different groups we can mention here. With horticulture, we started to see, among other things, cultures start to be sedentary and live in one location to grow these fields. And probably they started to do this because you could get more output from 1 acre, or from a smaller area. Now, the environmental impacts of horticulture, oftentimes horticulture could be quite sustainable. And indeed, Pigs for the Ancestors is a great example of a horticultural system that was quite sustainable because of some specific practices of those people, right? We talked about that with the pigs being killed off at a certain point. And slash and burn agriculture and traditional rice paddy culture that you read about in your readings are both examples of forms of agriculture that were traditionally very sustainable. Rice agriculture in part because there was gently moving water that would get rid of some of the things and provide aeration and things like that. Swidden or slash and burn because it allows groups to use an area till the nutrients are used up, then move to another area and allow the formerly used area to replenish and to grow back plant life. And particularly in the tropics, where a lot of the biomass is stored in plants, that is an environmental system that works pretty well when you're doing it with small groups of people that are allowed to move their crops throughout a certain area. Slash and burn, though, has a negative connotation in the American West, partly because of effects on the Amazon. But we should remember that these effects do not stand in a political or a cultural vacuum, and in fact that slash and burn agriculture is probably not the biggest impact on the Amazon at all. I would put that much more so with large-scale deforestation by logging companies as well as large-scale ranching operations. And to any degree that slash and burn has been problematic, it's more so because populations have increased, groups have been displaced. In general, the indigenous subsistence society has changed or shifted or been made different, or new people have moved in and disrupted the original system of use of the environment. So generally horticulture was pretty low impact, and it oftentimes relied on things that were just good environmental common sense. Shifting cultivation or Swidden allows land to restore itself. The sort of flooded rice agriculture allows water to flow and get rid of contaminants and aerate and things like that. And polyculture is another common part of horticulture, which basically means that multiple different plants are grown together, and the end result of that being that not just one nutrient is being taken from the soil. So for example, you plant one plant that takes up nutrients and one that puts nutrients back, like a legume that will put nitrogen back in the soil. So polyculture, in contrast with, say, industrialized agriculture, where you have hundreds of acres of one crop, horticulture, you oftentimes have many different crops in one area of land. These different types of practices that horticulturalists have used for millennia tend to be quite sustainable on small scales and and if the system isn't majorly interrupted. Agriculture is a little different from horticulture. It's the fourth system we're talking about today, and the third kind of food producing. So 1 food collecting, 3 food producing now. So the fourth system is agriculture. It is a larger, more complex form of farming, essentially distinct from horticulture in that it uses animal husbandry, so cattle to pull the plow and things like that and provide natural fertilizer. Produces more per acre than other forms. However, it also requires more input, extensive natural fertilizer, animal husbandry, and then in later forms, getting more into fertilizers in general. It requires irrigation a lot of times, although one could argue that horticulture sometimes does as well, but usually agriculture is more associated with actually needing water to be diverted to make this work. Sometimes, so animal power, things like that. And it's more so one location rather than shifting. And it produces a surplus, which is what allows for things like specialization, stratification, political elites, classes. This is a very complicated anthropological argument that we don't necessarily have time to get into. But point is, the shift to agriculture has huge effects on the fate of human life in general. Now, the environmental impacts of agriculture are obviously going to be increased beyond the other forms that we've talked about, potentially because, among other things, of irrigation and the diversion of water, as well as plows and how that can very significantly disrupt the soil if done improperly. But perhaps agriculture is still relatively environmentally benign in many cases. It is with the shift to industrialized agriculture, the fifth food system, the fifth subsistence strategy, that we really start to see really catastrophic impacts on the environment. Now, industrialized agriculture is a subset really of industrialization in general, which was a large-scale shift starting in kind of really the 1700s, 1800s is really when it started picking up, where things changed from being a home producing for itself to large-scale capitalist factories and companies and firms and heavy use of machinery, fossil fuels, things like that. And really within the last 200 years particularly. Now, we live in a heavily industrialized society, and agriculture is one part of that has become very industrialized. So when you think of like a feedlot where you have hundreds of cattle kept in a small building and fed with, and milked potentially with like automatic milking machines, we're really talking about agriculture treated like a factory. And indeed, we have terms like factory farming to reflect these kinds of reality, or where you have sort of moving conveyor belts taking animals. But even not so much even factory farming, but even if we're to take it a step back, even just the use of much larger farms, potentially run by corporations, but not always, a lot of use of tractors and mechanical things, all of these are kind of signs of industrialized agriculture, using mechanized technologies, and oftentimes it relies on heavy inputs. Now, we don't really need to talk about that. So industrialized agriculture is specialized mechanical. It's large scale, typically taking place on hundreds of acres, if not thousands, and it requires high inputs, is the key point here. It can produce really more than any of the food production systems potentially. It can produce just huge amounts, which is one of the reasons that we can have 5% of Americans farming and producing food, first of all, to provide much of the domestic food need, and then also export quite a bit to other countries. And so it is just extremely productive in that way, and industrialized agriculture is one of the reasons that we're able to produce food for some of the 8 billion people, or well, 7+ billion people. However, industrialized agriculture, taken from an environmental standpoint, requires huge inputs of outside things to make that work. So whereas horticulture really relies on local ecosystem processes, natural processes of soil, having plants put in it, growing up, nutrients being depleted, somebody moving and letting the land just naturally ecologically restore itself, whereas pastoralism relies on herds moving around, and when they've overeaten an area, moving to another and allowing the area to regrow. And even agriculture, to a great degree, relies sort of on natural processes. It is with industrialized agriculture that we really see human beings controlling the ecosystem in a much more direct way. The ecosystem becomes very simplified in that many of the things that we don't want are removed, and it becomes very controlled, and very much outside things have to be brought in to make this work as an ecosystem. So rather than soil naturally replenishing itself, a lot of times, not always, there are farmers that'll do things like mixing up their cropping patterns to bring nutrients back, but sometimes industrialized agriculture really relies heavily on, well, I should not say not sometimes, but oftentimes it relies heavily on artificial fertilizers to get nutrients into the soil, because the soil is really not being allowed to be replenished in the same way. This allows you to crop year after year after year after year, and thus produce a lot from one area of land. However, it involves an incredible amount of energy to produce artificial fertilizers. Similarly, artificial pesticides to make up for the fact that when you grow a monocrop, you're more susceptible to pests. By which I mean when you grow only one type of crop, it's more likely that one pest can wipe it out. Think like the potato blight in Ireland. So to account for that, industrialized agriculture has to use heavy use of pesticides and herbicides. And one of the only reasons they can get the high yields they get is because of that. So thinking about it as and it utilizes complex machinery, high-yielding seed varieties. One part of this is genetically modified organisms, of course, is now a part of industrialized agriculture. And I would say genetically modified organisms are sort of an outgrowth, a logical extension, in a sense, of what industrialized agriculture is, which is trying to produce the most amount of food possible per a certain area. Sorry, that just wasn't really relevant. That was stuff from cultural anthropology lecture. Now, environmental impacts of industrialized agriculture, again, very high output, which we could see that as potentially an environmentally good thing, because very high output per acre means we don't have to use as much land for farming, means we can cut down, in a sense, less natural areas to use for farming. So some would argue that industrialized agriculture is good for the environment in this regard, also that it's good for human beings and that it can produce a lot. And indeed at this point, and this is kind of a complex discussion that we might need to get into next time I'm there, but at this point we are producing enough through agriculture and other things that there's enough food for every human being on the planet. Despite our extremely high population, it works out to something like 2,500 to 3,000 calories per person. What agriculture is producing, even at current rates, is enough to give everybody a fairly good diet of, again, around 2,500 calories. The reason that there are things like famines and starvation has a lot more to do with political and economic factors, people being denied food, people not having access to food. However, there's literally enough food to go around. So industrialized agriculture, the effects of it in that regard have been very positive in the sense that it can produce much more food. However, the environmental impact can be really significant, and there are many ways that it can result in unsustainable farming practices. It should not be assumed, though, that industrialized agriculture is unsustainable. Rather, we should look at it more specifically rather than just painting it with a broad brush. Because certainly there are people that are technically doing industrialized agriculture, but are doing things like crop rotation and stuff that keeps their agriculture still fairly sustainable, still, however, it does rely on outside inputs. So the question is, can something be truly sustainable if it's relying on outside inputs? I think my argument would be, really it's not. It's not strictly speaking sustainable because it's not sustainable on its own terms from its own resources. However, one could argue it doesn't mean just because something relies on outside resources and machinery doesn't necessarily mean it's unsustainable. And some forms of industrialized agriculture, in fact, result in more sustainability, like drip irrigation, which is a very kind of scientific, technical way of doing irrigation, which results in much less water use than sort of the flood irrigation that a lot of earlier agricultural cultures were using. So again, industrialized agriculture shouldn't always be assumed to be the environmental bad guy. However, it has had significant environmental impacts that we need to talk about and address, partly because it's applied in such a whole-scale way, even over landscapes where it's probably not appropriate, which again relies, when that is done, when industrialized agriculture, for example, is done in the middle of the desert, that means we have to be getting water from somewhere. So diverting water, massive amounts of water from a river, is a common practice. Now, GMOs is an important part of industrialized agriculture that we should talk about. And basically, GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are types of domesticated species, predominantly, where genes have been altered by artificial or laboratory genetic engineering. I want to make a very important point that it's not the same thing as simply hybridizing species or selective breeding. So there's GMOs, and the people that want GMOs or like GMOs, the argument here is that it will allow us to produce a lot more or produce better food in some way. So you can produce food that has a longer shelf life or is more resistant to herbicides, so you can use more herbicides, thereby keeping the fields more safe from competing plants. So there's a lot of arguments for GMOs, and some people feel that this is really the answer to feeding an increasingly large human population. However, people that are against it raise concerns about, for example, what if these artificially created plant species escape into the wild and become a problem as introduced species? Also, are there human health impacts? A lot of concerns with GMOs. Now, that debate goes back and forth. Part of the problem is that people don't always distinguish well in their minds how genetically modified organisms are very different. People sometimes will say things like, oh, we've been modifying organisms for centuries. And that's true. We've been selectively breeding cows to be more docile, or turkeys to be larger, or things like that. Breeding the larger turkeys to breed with the larger turkeys so that we eventually have the largest turkeys possible, right? At which point now we have absurdly large turkeys, domesticated turkeys. So we've been doing selective breeding for a long time, and this does alter genes within a species. However, it does it primarily by drawing on the genetic resources of that species and through a fairly natural process, although heavily human engineered. Genetic engineering, by contrast, allows the potential to, among other things, introduce genes that aren't even from that species to a new species. So, the infamous example of the fish gene in a strawberry to make the strawberry have a longer shelf life. And this is really opening up an entirely different domain. It really shouldn't be treated the same as selective breeding. So that, to me, is not a good argument when people say, oh, we've been doing this for centuries. No, we haven't. We haven't been pulling from one species and putting it into another species for centuries. This is a new phenomena, and the science on it is still very new, and it's something that deserves careful scrutiny. Now, what are some of the potential environmental problems of agriculture? That's kind of what I want to finish up on, and specifically industrialized agriculture. But this also applies to agriculture in general, and some of these even apply to horticulture, as you saw in the readings. One of the big problems potentially is soil erosion. So soil is essentially the substrate on which all of our plants grow. And there are, some of you are being clever now and saying, oh, what about hydroponics, where plants are sort of grown in a water solution? However, for the vast majority of human history and for the vast majority of farming, that is not how we farm. We farm using soil. Soil is a readily abundant resource that provides nutrients, provides structure for plants to grow in, is really foundationally critical to plants because they need those nutrients. Now, soil is, however, susceptible to erosion, whether that's wind picking up soil and moving it, or water picking up soil and moving it. Soil can, if farming is not done properly, move. And we've seen this before. You've seen, for example, construction sites where there's a bunch of bare dirt around and dust is sort of flying. That's erosion. That's soil going from where it's supposed to be, quote unquote, to somewhere else. The problems for that, of course, are human health if it gets in your lungs. Also pollution if it gets in the rivers, right? You get a bunch of dirt moving into a river. That's not good for it. But it's also a problem for the farmer, right? They're losing soil that they should be able to farm with. And indeed, at one point, one statistic, this was in the early 2000s that I read this, was that 33% of soils in the U.S. were depleting faster than they were being replenished. So soil over time builds up, partly because bacteria and different organisms break down plants and add to the soil. However, that's a natural process of soil renewal. That's one of the reasons that things like horticulture work, is because if you give it enough time, land will grow back more soil and grow back more nutrients naturally. It's an amazing thing that ecology does. It's an ecosystem service. However, under conditions of soil erosion, what's happening is the soil is being taken away faster than it's being replenished, and that is it is textbook definition of unsustainable. If continued long enough, that means you're losing entire fields, right? That means that you're losing the very material out of which we make food. When you look at food, look at it not just as a living organism, but as a living organism that's made out of dirt, partly, right? Because a bunch of the nutrients that went into the vegetable that you're eating are from the dirt. So when you lose dirt, that's a real problem. And indeed, many of the classic things done by industrialized agriculture hurt soil significantly, including heavy tilling. And so that's one of the reasons that there's been a big push in recent decades towards getting farmers to get away from tilling. Tilling is this whole taking a plow through soil, getting it all cleaned up after you've harvested it. And it makes for very clean looking fields and fields that are devoid of a lot of detritus and things like that. However, it also makes for a bunch of soil that's really disrupted and ready to just be picked up by the wind or the water. So there's been a real push to do minimum till or low till. Salinization. So I need to check the time. I can really get just obsessed with these topics. Wow, I've been talking for a really long time. My apologies. So I will try to make this a little quicker. Salinization is another potential environmental problem, and what we see with that is when there's multiple things that can cause this, because basically salinization is when a soil gets too salty and it becomes essentially toxic to plants or unusable to most plants. Now, salinization can happen, among other things, by irrigation. When you overly irrigate an area, it can cause evapotranspiration, leaving salts on the surface, especially if you're irrigating with too salty of water. And what this eventually leads to is extremely salty soils that aren't very useful for crops. Water pollution is a huge problem. With feedlots where we have hundreds of pigs or hundreds of cows, one of the biggest problems is that there's extensive amounts of manure produced in one area. What this can cause is manure is actually extremely high in nutrients, including nitrogen, that has to be put somewhere. Usually what happens is that ends up leaking into water and into streams, and then that excess nutrients causes what's called an algal die-off, or an algae die-off, or an algae bloom. This can also happen, by the way, from phosphates from laundry detergent can also cause this phenomena. But an algae die-off is basically when the algae in a river or a stream get too much, or a pond for that matter, get too much nutrients because of something, usually a human something, which is why we call it cultural eutrophication. They get too many nutrients, the algae grow and grow and grow, and you're saying that sounds like a good thing, but the problem is eventually they run out. The algae gets too much, runs out, saps the system too much, and then the algae die off. And as the algae die off, what happens is they decompose, and as they decompose, the process of decomposition sucks oxygen out of the water, which means that what ultimately happens is that fish die off, and all the different animals living in that area die off. So cultural eutrophication can be a real problem, and this can be caused from excessive fertilizer coming off of fields or excessive manure out of feedlots. Another water pollution problem is obviously sediment coming out of soil erosion. And another is just pesticides. Use extensive pesticides, there's going to be pollution of the water. The question is how significant of a problem that is. If you're interested in issues of pesticide pollution, I highly recommend the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, written in the 60s. It's still a very valuable or very valuable book, and a very easily readable book to talk about why pesticides are such a concern. And one of the points that Carson makes, which a lot of people would take issue with, but I think is a worthy point, is that ultimately pesticides rely on killing something, and so they're really probably not safe for any form of life. And there's a degree of truth to that. They're more unsafe for pests, perhaps, but they're certainly unsafe for human beings, and we've seen that they can cause significantly damaging impacts, for example, on central nervous systems for farm workers. So pesticides are a real problem. And at one point, eagles and peregrine falcons were almost extinct in large part because of pesticide use, partly for farming, partly for other purposes. But pesticides were being used widely in the U.S., especially DDT, in the first half of the 20th century. And this led to bald eagles almost going extinct because the DDT was accumulating in eagles as they ate lots of animals that had DDT or had eaten other animals that had DDT. Anyways, the point is the pesticides accumulated in bald eagles and made their shells so fragile that they would sit on them and break them. And so bald eagles, our national animal, were dying rapidly. Same thing with peregrine falcons. Since banning DDT, both species doing much better. Air pollution is obviously an issue when you have something like soil flying all over the place or pesticides being used. Soil pollution as well. Pesticides, herbicides, and of course, climate change. When we're talking about industrialized agriculture, we're not talking about somebody just walking through a field using a digging stick and putting seeds down. We're talking about tractors that use lots and lots of fuel moving through the landscape, and that's going to add to climate change. And then, of course, genetic diversity loss. One of the concerns with industrialized agriculture is it is so focused on highest output and also very focused on giving consumers a predictable product. And in that regard, and also because it's oftentimes controlled by large corporations, now with the advent of GMOs, there's a push towards, developing and marketing your own strain of a crop. and really pushing everybody to use that. So all these different things combined means that industrialized agriculture tends to use fewer and fewer plant species and bring it down to just like, maybe 5 plant species that they grow. So instead of the many, many different kinds of potatoes, we're growing, russet potatoes over and over and over again. Instead of the many different kinds of corn, you're growing one single kind of corn, or maybe 2 or 3 kinds of corn. What that leads to potentially is that we lose crop species. When crop species are no longer grown, if somebody's not putting this in a seed bank, and there are efforts to put these things in seed banks or to revitalize their use, but if we don't get that done properly, what we're losing is we're losing different species that were once used as food sources. And that's a dangerous place to be. That's dangerous when we start to put all our eggs in one basket and rely on just a few species. It's dangerous partly because when you use just one species or variety of a crop, if there's a pest that's really well adapted to it, suddenly you can have huge crop losses, or you have to use huge amounts of pesticides. So there's real concerns here with genetic diversity loss. We could talk about other things here. We could talk about honeybees as an environmental problem related to agriculture that's huge, and declines in honeybees, when honeybees and natural pollinators represent just huge amounts of natural pollination that allows agriculture in the US to work the way it does. So there's a lot of environmental problems here to focus on. I hope this reading was interesting to you. I hope these readings were thought-provoking to you in thinking about agriculture, thinking about food and where we get our food from. I hope it showed you that there are many ways we can get it, and also made you rethink where food comes from in the US and why it is the way it is. And then I hope this Shorman-Ouimet reading about middle-out conservation kind of helped you to realize that there's ways to get industrialized agriculture maybe to look better, to do better, to be more sustainable, and what specifically are the ways might kind of surprise us, right? So think about these things, spend some time thinking about food, eat a salad, think about where your food came from, and I'll see you next week to talk about climate change. By the way, in the reading for next week, there are 3 readings. Look for an email from me. One of the readings I might have a modification to. All right, thank you.